How do you reconcile these ideas of Christian dominance with a God who chooses not to dominate?
Yeah. You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up and explain why we are 700 miles apart. I'll let her explain the reasoning behind that. And then later on in the pod, Missy and I sit down with Matthew Taylor, who's got a new book out titled The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy. It is a great pod, and it is great to be back with you after our winter break. Stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Well, I am much better now that there is exactly 776 miles between us.
Wow. Man, shots fired. So explain to the audience why you are in such utopia being over 700 miles away from me.
Because I can no longer hear you coughing all night.
I am fighting a seasonal cold, definitely.
I have had a good night's sleep. I am happy. Yeah, so a few weeks ago, I think we even mentioned on the podcast, I was getting sick, losing my voice. We both ended up with a cold. I got better. And you, on the other hand, cannot shake the cough.
So what I just heard you explain, that this is really your fault. It started with your cold.
I think that's what I said.
Oh, okay. Well, that's what I heard. So, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So you have graciously relocated to the couch at least to sleep at night because you're coughing so much. But you know what? We've downsized. So now the couch is not that far away from the bedroom. So
No.
You got.
Yeah.
So when I received an invitation to head to the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, with some family for the week, I quickly agreed and have now enjoyed a quiet night's sleep.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you how fast she got packed and out of here when she got that invitation.
I know. And you know what, though? I mean, I guess karma kind of got me too, because I love snow and thinking I would see snow. And lo and behold, there's very little snow on the ground. It doesn't look like we're going to get any. Meanwhile, you back in Oklahoma are about to get several inches.
I'm so excited, and I'm really excited. This is going to be my first snowfall in the new old house.
Yes. So you have strict instructions.
Yes.
When it snows, if we get a good, few inches, that you were to get a picture, but not just any picture.
No, there's specifics.
I need you to go out the back door.
Right.
Walk around the side yard.
Correct.
Through the gate and along the property line so as to not mess up the snow in front of the house.
I can do that. I can military crawl. I can, leap over tall fences. So I can do that.
That's right. I want a picture of our house with the first good snow with the candles lit. So it has to be just at the right time in the evening. I want this picture and I'm trusting you to get it for me. I'm trusting you to keep the mailman off the snow until you get it.
I don't know if I can do that. My problem is it's not necessarily the mailman. It's what's going to happen if Cat shows up and starts tromping through the front yard.
I'm trusting Cat to be hiding somewhere during the snow, during the blizzard.
Okay.
Our picture of the snow cover.
Right. I'll get your picture and we will post it on socials.
You have your marching orders. So your job is to get a good picture of the snow and also to get back in touch with the doctor and ask for some better meds before I get home.
Okay. I'll do it. Deal.
That's what you're supposed to do.
That's right. Well, I am glad that you got away. I'm glad you're in the Rocky Mountains. But I kind of miss you. It's kind of quiet around here, but I am still coughing. So I get your pain.
Yeah.
Well, Missy, you and I got to sit down this week with Matthew Taylor. He's got a book out called The Violent Take It by Force. And we're going to talk about this and unpack it after we talk with Matthew. But it was just really interesting. Talking to him brought up a lot of memories of me growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma during the 1980s.
Right. So the book talks about the charismatic movement, which I think you just mentioned, and it really goes into depth to great detail of this movement and just how prominent it is in kind of today's political culture. Which I guess, I mean, I knew about it. I knew you and I've talked about
Right.
how this movement kind of showed itself even in our, non-charismatic churches, but didn't really realize the depths of it. I
Yeah.
didn't. But yeah, it was definitely around for our upbringing, and we had some crazy experiences. You especially living kind of in the epicenter of some of that culture.
Yeah, I did. You know, what was interesting to me is that Matthew in the book, and again, we're going to talk about this later on, he talks about how this movement that, began decades ago, this modern day movement that began decades ago, really morphed into a mainline evangelical influencer within churches like ours that we grew up in, that were Southern Baptists back in the 1980s, into what is now a political force in American politics. But you and I started talking about those early days in the 80s, growing up in Southern Baptist churches, about the kind of influence that permeated our churches from the charismatic movement. And growing up in Tulsa, of course, there were many examples of that. But growing up in youth group, I can remember, the story that everybody tells of the youth minister bringing in the record player, turning the record player on, playing the record
Hmm.
backwards, and hearing messages from Satan come right from the vinyl itself. And, in my 14-year-old self, my mind was just blown when I would hear those things. And you'd really have to listen hard to get the messages. There's a lot of kind of talking you into what you were hearing. But yeah, I can remember
I hear that, but yet suddenly when I say, "Hey, can you unload the dishwasher?" that gets lost. I'm just trying to figure this out.
Maybe you need to put it in vinyl and spin it backwards, and I'll hear it. Try
Yeah.
to.
I remember in youth group one time too, and this is not a funny story at all, but it was a Wednesday night Bible study,
Mhm.
and all of, we were waiting in there for the youth minister to get there. So somebody came in and told us our youth minister was out in the hallway dealing with an exorcism of one of our
Wow, really?
except
Yeah.
for the youth group.
Mhm.
Yes. So then from then on, she was the girl who had been possessed.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that
Wow.
spiritual warfare
Yeah.
just theme going on, and it was about that time. I don't think I consciously started questioning and thinking this is crazy, but
Yeah.
about that time I got my driver's license and started kind of going to a different church and disconnected from that influence. But I just remember that being really wild to me, that on the other side of the wall in a church, there was a demon possession exorcism happening. It's really weird.
Yeah. I can remember back in the 80s, especially in Tulsa, there was this book that went around. And in fact, I think I mentioned it in our talk with Matthew, but it was called This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti. Do you remember that going around in
Mhm.
Texas at all?
Oh, I remember everybody. I think I was the only one of my age group that did not read them.
Yeah, and it was a story centered here in the universe or in the real world, but then also it paralleled what was going on in the spiritual world between angels and demons and this incredible spiritual warfare that was taking place. And I can remember being very attracted to that back in the 80s because, that's what was being taught in a Southern Baptist church, that this could be a possibility. And then also there was a lot of pressure on us as teenagers to receive a spiritual blessing. And a lot of times that meant speaking in tongues. And so I was having these leaders, tell me, if you really love Jesus, or if you're sold out for Jesus, or, all of the terminology that you heard back then. If you really, were committed, then the Holy Spirit would bless you with speaking in tongues. And so it was quite an endeavor to try to figure out, is this something that is truly a spiritual experience or something that I'm being coerced into doing? And of course, later on I figured out I was being coerced to do it.
So yeah, it's with all of the spiritual warfare, the demonic, and then like you said, the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues. You have a really, I mean, I find it funny story about the healings
Yeah.
that happen.
Yeah. So again, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, between Oral Roberts University. Oral Roberts, the televangelist, had a healing ministry, even though I thought it was odd because he built this huge hospital right next to the university, but still had the healing ministry. But I digress. Grew up between Oral Roberts and Rhema Bible Institute, both two huge charismatic movements within the Tulsa.
Which I think are both mentioned.
Yeah,
in
they're
the
both
book.
mentioned in the book. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the prominent churches in the area was Higher Dimensions Evangelical Center, and the pastor at the time was Carlton Pearson. Now, Carlton has since then decided that everybody is saved. He became a Unitarian. Unfortunately, Carlton Pearson passed away a couple of years ago. Really intriguing story. But at the time, he was going to be the successor to Oral Roberts at the university. And so it was at the height of his popularity. So we would go to church on Sunday nights at Higher D. And there was this faith healer that came through called Mario Murillo. And we were really interested in this theology and what was going on at this church because there's a lot of excitement built around it. Also, I don't mean to brag, Missy, but the 1980s Christian artist Carmen went there as well. So I went to Carmen.
Lucky you.
Yeah, exactly.
Proximity.
So the end of the service comes with Murillo. It came time for the healing, and he was going to put a healing upon anybody who came up to the front. So my buddies and I decided that we were going to trek up to the front and get a blessing by Pastor Murillo. But we made a pact on the way up that no matter how hard he pushed, no matter how much we felt the Holy Spirit, we were not going to go down and get slain in the Spirit, as they call it. And so we made this pact with one another. And so we go down to the front.
You may need to explain that's what happened.
That's what happened. Yeah. That's what we've been watching. We've been watching this a couple of nights. And so Pastor Murillo would come to the front. He would offer a healing upon people. He would touch them on the forehead, and then they would collapse to the floor. And that's what is known as being slain in the Spirit. Well, we decided that we wanted to try this out, see if it was legitimate or not. But we were not going to go down by coercion or manipulation. We were going to truly go down if it happened to us. So we make this pact. We go to the front, and Pastor Murillo gets to us, and I'm the first one, and he hits me. I mean, when I say hits me on the forehead, and is praying in tongues and expects me to go down, but I don't go down. And he can look at me and tell, okay, this is going to take some extra blessing on his part. So he comes back and hits me again, and I still
more of
the Holy Spirit, and I still don't go down. And my buddies at this time are giggling next to me, and it only took about 2 seconds after that where Pastor Murillo realized that we were a lost cause, and he went on. But we had a good time trying to figure out if this was real or not. We decided it wasn't because we didn't feel anything from his quote unquote blessing.
You a bunch of ornery teenagers. You just needed an exorcism.
That's right. We should have been going to your church down in Texas. We could have been exorcised from our demons. Well, all of that is, really interesting. It's part of our childhood. But what Matthew describes in the book is really startling. Again, how this fringe movement within Christianity has grown to the extent now that it has really significant political influence, especially with a second Trump presidency facing us. And it's a really interesting conversation we have with Matthew.
Yes. And like a lot of things, it's worrisome, but at the same time, it's something that we all need to be aware of and all need to be attuned to as we head into the next 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So Missy and I will be right back with Matthew Taylor to talk about his new book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian Movement That is Threatening Our Democracy. We've got a lot going on at Good Faith Media in 2025. New logo, new website, new initiatives. And if you don't know, our new magazine. Good Faith Magazine includes Bible study and lessons. Our new lesson writers are Kathy and Nathan Maxwell, and they host a free, short, weekly podcast in support of their Bible study lessons. In the Good Faith Bible Study Podcast, and it's free. Learn more about the magazine, the lessons, the Maxwells, the podcast, and more at goodfaithmedia.org. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. We've got a very special guest with us today. Matthew D. Taylor is senior scholar at the Institute of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, Maryland, where he specializes in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religious politics. His new book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy, tracks how a loose network of charismatic Christian leaders called the New Apostolic Reformation was a major instigating force for the January 6th insurrection back in 2021 and is currently reshaping the culture of the religious right in the United States. Matthew, welcome to Good Faith Weekly and congratulations on the book.
Thank you for having me here, Mitch.
So, Matthew, thank you for being here today. And first, all I have to say is, wow, this book. I just don't even know what to say. I have spent so much time in the space learning about evangelical movement as far as how that has affected our political environment, and then we also spend time talking about and reading about the mainstream Protestantism and how that has contributed to where we are today. And then you just went and added another layer in there that I really didn't want. So thanks for that.
Oh my goodness.
You have written a book about the charismatic movement and how that has played into where we are today. And so I know Mitch is really excited to geek out with you about all of this.
I am, absolutely.
Okay, so but before we do that, for those of us like me who don't just marinate in this all the time, I wondered if I could just take some time to set some foundational information for those who may not also be like me. Um, First of all, can you define NAR for us, which is the New Apostolic Reformation?
Yeah, so New Apostolic Reformation is a phrase that was coined in the 1990s. It was coined at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is my alma mater. And the basic idea was that there would be a new reformation, a new revival that would sweep across the church, that would be led by apostles and prophets. That's where you get the term apostolic in there. And this was really centered around a guy named C. Peter Wagner, who was a professor at Fuller Seminary. He's the one who really grabbed hold of this phrase and really started trying to form a movement around it. And he started building a set of leadership networks of people who believed themselves to be apostles and prophets, modern day apostles and prophets. And this is all operating in this kind of non-denominational charismatic space, kind of the non-denominational wing of Pentecostalism, you could think of it as. And so these folks who believe themselves to be apostles and prophets, they formed these networks. There were hundreds of people who joined these networks in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And if you fast forward about a decade, those leadership networks that we called the New Apostolic Reformation became the backbone of Christian support for Donald Trump. They were the folks who endorsed Trump very early on, who offered a lot of the theological rationales for supporting Donald Trump, and became a very, very important component to his appeal, not only to evangelicals, but to Christians in general.
Talk just a little bit about the theology that is driving this movement.
Yeah, so they have an idiosyncratic theology in many ways, but it's become very, very popular. So the basic idea, as I said, is that they believe in apostles and prophets. That most Christians believe that there were apostles and prophets in the early church. These folks believe that there are modern apostles and prophets who are being commissioned by the Holy Spirit to lead the church, and they think that apostles and prophets should be the primary leadership layer in the church today, that these folks should be the ones at the forefront of guiding churches, both at the congregational level, at the regional level, at the national level. And then they also believe very strongly in spiritual warfare, this idea that there are angels and demons who are battling all around us for control of the world, those battles affect humanity, affect Christians. And I mean, many Christians believe in spiritual warfare, but the New Apostolic Reformation adds this high octane vision of spiritual warfare with hierarchies of demons that they're battling back, and what they call territorial spirits, these high-ranking demons who can control literal physical territory. And this is all this is kind of becomes the backdrop then for January 6th, right? Because a lot of the activities that Christians are doing around the US Capitol are spiritual warfare activities. And then the third piece that is really important to understand about the NAR in terms of their theology is they believe in something called dominion theology. And this idea is that Christians should, and this is I would argue a pretty strange interpretation of the first chapter of the book of Genesis, but the basic idea is that Christians are supposed to have dominion over every society, and the Christians are supposed to be in rulership over various societies. And this all gets encoded for the NAR in a phrase that they call the Seven Mountain Mandate, where they divide up society into seven different cultural spheres: education, government, family, religion, media, arts and entertainment, business. And they think that Christians should take over every one of those spheres, take control over every one of those mountains. They imagine every one of those is one of these mountains, and Christians should take over the top of the mountain and then have Christian influence flow down into society. So the very aggressive theological vision, very domineering. They'll even positively say, hey, we are colonizing the earth with a culture of heaven, and think that colonizing is a good thing. So this is a very hyperactive, very aggressive vision of Christian theology that has backstopped Donald Trump.
So hearing your explanation right now, a thought just came to mind. Was that this could have just been started by a bunch of people who weren't allowed to play role-playing games as teenagers? I mean, just like,
It's funny because I think there's a temptation to think that these folks are LARPing, right? That they're this is live action role play, and they're just doing this for kicks. They really believe this stuff,
Yeah.
and they're very sincere, and that
yeah,
to me that's actually more scary, right? Because it's one thing like, oh, it's kind of funny or goofy. No, this is not goofy. They truly believe this, and it has real world impacts, as we saw on January 6th.
yeah, clearly. So tell us real quick before we go further, who are some of the main players? You mentioned C. Peter Wagner, who is obviously a big. I shouldn't say character. Now we talked role playing person in this movement and in your book. But tell us who are some others that we need to be aware of.
So most of the characters of the book are from Peter Wagner's inner circle. So they include people like Cindy Jacobs, who is a major prophet in the New Apostolic Reformation, who was there on January 6th. Che On, who is one of the most respected apostles in these networks, who is a pastor in California, also an apostle, has this massive network, was there on January 6th. Lance Wallnau, who is sort of a prophet, apostle, teacher, business consultant. He kind of runs the gamut, and he's the one who actually came up with the Seven Mountain Mandate idea. There's a guy named Dutch Sheets who is very, very influential in charismatic media spaces, has written a lot of very popular books. Many people who don't operate in those spaces haven't heard of him, but he's very well known. And then I also focus on Sean Foyt, who is a very prominent worship leader right now, activist, very kind of far right agitator. And then I also look at Paula White Cain. Even though Paula White Cain, I would not argue is part of the New Apostolic Reformation proper, she is Donald Trump's closest spiritual advisor, and she's very into this idea of apostles and prophets, and has been in many ways the bridge builder who brought a lot of these NAR and other charismatic figures into the Trump camp, and then has kind of brought them into the inner circle of power.
Well, Matthew, I
So,
love books that are well researched, and this book is well researched. It is put together, uh, telling the story of the New Apostolic Reformation. And you don't have to tell me that they believe this stuff, because I grew up in the hotbed of Tulsa, Oklahoma, of charismatic theology between Oral Roberts University and Rhema Bible Institute. So a lot of these characters that are in the book I have heard of or been exposed to just growing up in Tulsa. In fact, I can remember going to Higher Dimensions Evangelical Center near ORU, where Carlton Pearson used to be the pastor there before he kind of saw the light. Just remember just thinking to myself, wow, this is some really interesting theology that they have. Because, you talk about the angels and demons and spiritual warfare. I can remember the Peretti book being handed to me as a young man, and saying, hey, read this. This is really good stuff. This is what's going on all around us. So all of this I can confirm is true that you have articulated and chronicled here in the book. So with the movement defined, with the characters somewhat set into motion here. Let's talk about how this fringe group gained so much prominence within the Trump administration, because you do a really good job laying that story out.
Yeah, I think and we need to think back a little ways because, in fact, their first candidate, the person that they initially really wanted to be their banner carrier, was Sarah Palin.
Right.
Sarah Palin was mentored by an NAR prophet in Alaska, and when she got kind of plucked out of obscurity by John McCain to become the vice presidential candidate in 2008, the New Apostolic Reformation networks really thought that was their moment in the sun. They thought that this was going to be their vehicle for promoting this vision of taking over the Seven Mountains, especially the Government Mountain. And then, of course, Sarah Palin and John McCain lost. And so they were kind of in the wilderness for about 8 years during the Obama administration. And then when Donald Trump enters the political scene in June of 2015, he turns to Paula White Cain, who is his own personal pastor and spiritual advisor, and says, "I want you to be my bridge builder to evangelicals. You're in charge of outreach to evangelicals. Very important task." But she doesn't know the A-listers of the religious right. She's not That's not her world. She is a televangelist and a megachurch pastor and an apostle. And so she starts inviting in the people that she knows, including people like Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountains guy, to come and meet with Trump. This is in the fall of 2015. This is just as the campaign is ramping up into the primary. And there's a series of these meetings at Trump Tower in the fall of 2015 with a number of non-denominational charismatic leaders, including some NAR folks. And that group becomes the inner core of Trump's evangelical advisors. And it's in some of these meetings where you first start hearing some of these prophecies about Donald Trump, including one from Lance Wallnau that becomes very, very famous, where he says that Donald Trump is a modern day Cyrus. Right. And if you're if you're not familiar with the passage, this is Isaiah chapter 45, right? The Jews have been taken away by the Babylonian Empire into exile in Babylon. The Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and Cyrus is the emperor of the Persians who sends the Jews back from exile to go and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Wallnau is saying is that Donald Trump is like that. He can return conservative Christians from their cultural exile. He will be a secular savior to the evangelical movement. And this becomes a major part of the narrative for why evangelicals choose to vote for Donald Trump, as they say, he's not a good man, but he's God's man, and we need to get behind him. And these folks are saying this before a single vote has been cast in the primary. They're saying, this is God's candidate here. And that has become the narrative for the last decade that has ensconced Trump in this aura of spirituality and prophecy.
Wow.
So I was going to ask you about Cyrus anointing as well, and so I'm so glad you brought that up. But I just wanted to say I made note of two quotes that you had in the book regarding this, and where Wallnau says Trump may be a bastard, but he can be our bastard.
Right.
And I just and then when the Access Hollywood tape was released, he says God can do more with Samson than with a Jezebel. Yeah. And it's baffling to me how the mental gymnastics required to get behind this person, but some of those statements are just crazy.
Yeah, and in fact, the actual quote on the Samson Jezebel, God could use the jawbone of an ass, to slaughter 1,000 Philistines, but God could never use a Jezebel, right? So he wasn't even comparing Trump to Samson; he was comparing Trump to the jawbone of a donkey that Samson used to slaughter the Philistines, right? Trump. He was saying Trump is just a weapon. Yeah. In the hand of God, right? He was not even trying to offer any sort of indication of his character at that point.
Yeah.
At least they're owning it at this point.
Yeah,
they are honest about it. There's nothing about that.
Honest about it.
So Matthew, let's go a little bit back to our original question about kind of the theology behind this, because we talk about the spiritual warfare, we talk about the Cyrus anointing. All of this sounds strange for those of us who grew up in Baptist churches or mainline churches. And so this seems to have a little bit of a tinge of Calvinism associated with it, but it seems to be different than the classical Calvinism that we learned about in seminary and have talked about here on this show. This seems to be ratcheted up like they are anointed to rule over the world.
Yes. And in fact, a lot of these ideas do have roots in Calvinism. There's a group of Calvinist theologians called the Reconstructionists that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. R.J. Rushdoony, Gary North, his son-in-law, and they're the ones who really create this dominion theology idea. But the Reconstructionists are very formal Calvinists, very kind of rigid in their kind of systematic theology. They're popular among kind of the leaders of the religious right, but they are not widely popular.
Right.
And in the 1980s, they actually start collaborating with some of these non-denominational charismatic networks and leaders, and they have a realization that their ideas are not going to spread very far if they are the only ones promoting them. But if the charismatics adopt these ideas, they'll become much more popular. And so what happens is dominion theology kind of gets seeded into the charismatic movement in the 1980s and 1990s, and that is the wellspring out of which the NAR comes, is this kind of these dominion theology ideas coming out of the Reconstructionists, blending with charismatic paradigms, getting encoded in charismatic language like the Seven Mountain Mandate. But then in the process, it also does become a more accelerationist vision. The Reconstructionists were more gradualist. They're like, we're going to reform society, turn America into a godly society over generations and centuries. The NAR comes along and says, we can do this right now. We have the power of the Holy Spirit. We have apostles and prophets. We have the authority to do this right now. And it's that kind of an attitude, that accelerationist mindset, that is very, very important for understanding January 6th, because they thought that they could push things over the finish line using these kind of spiritual authority and spiritual warfare tactics, that they thought that they could revolutionize society overnight.
You mentioned at one point towards the end of the book a term I've made note of, but spiritual warmongers is the group that you're most concerned about. I mean, do you really think? I mean, do they think in a traditional sense God is calling them to go to war?
Yeah, they think they're already at war.
Right.
I mean, they believe that everything is a cosmic war between good and evil, between Satan and God, and that they are major players in that war, that they are commanders and generals in that war. Now, they would say it's a spiritual war, but they're also very clear that spiritual war has real world consequences, right? So a lot of the leaders who show up, the Christian leaders who show up on January 6th, and I have tracked 60 non-denominational charismatic leaders to Washington, D.C. on January 6th. But a lot of those leaders did not go into the Capitol. They saw their role as providing the spiritual complement to what the rioters were doing. They were praying against the demons that they believed had stolen the election. And so they saw their role as kind of commanders in spiritual warfare, generals of spiritual warfare is the phrase that they'll sometimes use to describe apostles and prophets. But then again, they will sometimes say, and the reason that apostles are generals is that if everything was up to pastors, then the church would never kill anyone.
Yeah.
It's like, hold on a minute.
Right.
We just jumped from spiritual warfare to
yeah.
So they'll always walk right up to that line of talking about violence, but then they'll try to categorize it as spiritual in order to downplay it. But part of my argument in the book is you can't draw that line.
Yeah.
In fact, the impulse towards spiritual violence fuels real world violence, and we saw that in a visceral way on the 6th of January.
Well, we saw the rise of NAR during Trump's first run at the office, and then throughout his first term as president. Well, Matthew, guess what? We're back here again. We're facing a second Trump presidency beginning in just a few weeks. So what has the NAR been doing recently, and what can we expect to see as far as their influence and guidance on the president beginning this January?
When I wrote this book, at least when I started writing it, I really wanted it to be a history.
Right.
I wanted it to be
exactly, yeah,
and try to tell the story of January 6th and the spirituality of January 6th. And then as I was writing it, I started realizing, oh no, this is all happening again.
Right.
These leaders are just as active. In fact, these leaders are more popular today than they were on January 6th. Their ideas are more popular and widespread today. They contributed mightily to Donald Trump's victory in 2024. Lance Wallnau was actually working hand in glove with the Trump campaign, promoting and doing voter registration and voter drives. And these folks were offering constantly new prophecies about Donald Trump. In fact, right at the end of the campaign, the narrative shifted slightly. They had been talking about this Cyrus idea for years, that Donald Trump is a Cyrus, Donald Trump is a Cyrus. In the last few months of the campaign, they shifted and they started talking about Donald Trump is a Jehu. And if you don't get that reference,
Yeah.
because it's an obscure reference.
Right.
This is 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10. Jehu is this incredibly violent king of Israel who comes after the reign of Jezebel and Ahab, these notoriously wicked king and queen who rule over Israel. And Jehu goes on a rampage and slaughters Jezebel, slaughters their family, piles their children's heads at the gates, and just goes and kills anyone who is an ally of Ahab and Jezebel. And they say, our leaders would even talk about that is draining the swamp. Wow. So they took on a much more violent, even violent invocation, violent image that they were using around Trump to condition their followers to say he might have to use some violence here. That's just part of his mandate. That's part of the script he has to follow. So no, they have propagandized Trump. They have sold Trump to Christians as a good person, as a good leader, and they are very, very active right now in Trump's advisory circles. There's Trump has had a variety of iterations of his Christian advisory circles. The current one is called the National Faith Advisory Board. I'm not sure, they might change the name as they come into the new administration, but these folks they have the ear of the White House, and they are very interested in getting their agenda enacted. And their agenda typically syncs up with a lot of what we think of as the religious right, but they have a much more accelerationist mindset. They want this to happen very, very quickly.
Okay, well, now I'm just scared to death. But no, again, this is just so fascinating that this group that I was familiar with, obviously from growing up in Tulsa, has gained so much prominence and is affecting national policy and global policy right now in this age. And as you stated earlier, it's hard to get my colleagues to understand that they really truly believe what they're saying. The theology and the rhetoric that they espouse is what they believe. They are trying to enact these beliefs upon the world. And I wonder, since Trump has been elected and he's president-elect, we've heard a lot of talk about to territorial advancements, off the cuff, making Canada the 51st state, taking Greenland by force, taking the Panama Canal by force. Is that this acquisition, this colonialism, as you described it earlier on, is that part of the NAR theology and mindset as we face a second Trump president of taking on new lands, new acquisitions?
It's interesting that the New Apostolic Reformation has a very developed theology of nations. They really believe that nations are created by God, are ordained by God, and they have a very literalistic reading of the New Testament. So when they read the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus says, "Go into all the world and make disciples of the nations," most Christians throughout history have interpreted that as go and make disciples of the peoples of the nations. Go and reach the peoples of the nations. They interpret that as apostles are supposed to disciple nations. The nation becomes the object of Christian mission, the thing that is supposed to be Christianized. And so for them, I don't know that they would be that supportive of Trump taking territory from other countries, because again, they think that those countries are also ordained by God. And this is where sometimes even our language of Christian nationalism runs up against reality here, because these folks are more Christian internationalists. They want to take over the whole world with Christianity. Now, let me say though, I don't think they would challenge Trump on that, because part of what has happened over the last decade is these folks' agenda has become much closer to Trump's, more than his has become theirs. Like they have migrated his way. In fact, early on, some of the NAR leaders, especially because it's a very multi-ethnic movement, some of the Latinx, the Latina advisors to Donald Trump, who were coming out of this more New Apostolic Reformation mold, they pushed back on some of his immigration rhetoric in 2016 and said, "Hey, you're being kind of harsh. These are humans here. We need to. Can you dial it back?" None of that anymore. Those same leaders are just lockstep on board with Trump's even more aggressive anti-immigrant rhetoric. So I think in many ways their goal is to see Trump be successful,
Yeah.
and they will kind of provide and baptize his agenda and whatever prophecies and theology they need to in order to maintain their hold on power.
And as you were talking, I was reminded about one of the most important points you make in the book is that the NAR movement doesn't necessarily believe in a theocracy in a classical sense. And that's why, the Cyrus anointing and Jehu now, they don't really believe in a theocracy as we would classically understand that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the dictionary definition
Yeah.
of theocracy is that you have a set of clerics, a set of religious leaders ruling over society in the name of God. They would actually adopt more of a model kind of similar to what we see in Saudi Arabia, where
Mhm.
you have a secular government. Maybe we should put the secular in quotes, right?
Right, right, right.
Royal family, right? And so there's a monarch, and then there's this kind of spiritual class of leaders, the Wahhabis, who kind of control religion in the society. So that part of the idea of the seven mountains is each of these mountains, business, government, education, family, religion, has its own culture, has its own rules that people play by. And so they would say Donald Trump is not a good Christian. He is not a good religious leader. He is not a pious person. He's not a moral person, but he's very good at playing the game of conquering the government mountain. And
Mm.
that's what God has anointed him for, is to take over the government mountain, and then he'll govern in our name and on our behalf. Right. So they want a hold on power, but no, it's not a conventional theocratic mode of they want to take over society and rule over it. They want to be the people behind the person.
Yeah. Well, I've got one last question for you. I know Missy's dying to jump in here with a question, but here's my last question for you, Matthew. Um, when we hear all the statistics coming out about religion in the public square, that Christianity overall is in decline. But it sounds like these groups are actually growing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the most recent data that we have shows that they not only are these apostolic and prophetic and non-denominational charismatic spaces the fastest growing form of Christianity in the United States, they might be the only growing form of Christianity in the United States. They are also the fastest growing form of Christianity in the world.
Mhm.
So just to give you some numbers here, in 1970, the estimate is that there were about 44 million independent charismatics, non-denominational charismatics in the entire world. By 2020, the estimate was that it was up to 320 million. Right? So we're talking about a
Wow.
movement, a religious movement,
Yeah,
that's roughly doubling in size every 20 years, right?
that is
And
incredible.
globally. And in the US, these ideas have become incredibly popular. In fact, and these are the ideas that have been used to sell Donald Trump to evangelicals. And those ideas and those leaders have become popular along with Donald Trump. So, in many ways, Trump rode their coattails in 2016, and now they've ridden his coattails to great popularity and fame. Some of these leaders are now top tier leaders in the religious right and evangelicalism, and are some of the most popular figures in the country in terms of religious leaders.
Wow.
All right, Matthew. Let's bring it around. And talk. I mean, I remember when I was reading the book, just thinking, seeing some of the things you talk about, and remembering the ways in which even I was not in that movement, but how that influence even permeated my church experience growing up. So it's kind of scary. So what you're saying about how now everybody's kind of falling in line behind this way of thinking is really scary. But with all of that said, what do we do? Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very challenging season. So my general approach right now in thinking is that the MAGA movement is a populist authoritarian movement, and that's a technical category. I mean,
Mm.
this is something political scientists will talk about. So when we talk about populism, so it's an anti-elite movement, right? That is making claims upon people's anger and on their hope, kind of appealing to emotion in order to kind of gin up people's frustration in society. But then it's also authoritarian. They want to impose an autocratic dictatorial agenda through Donald Trump on society. And if we look around the world, we can see what happens when populist authoritarian movements that are wedded to religious nationalist movements take over a society. This has happened in Hungary with Viktor Orban.
Mm-hmm.
This has happened in Turkey with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This has happened in India with Narendra Modi and the Hindu nationalist movement. So this is a phenomenon, and the United States has become a part of that phenomenon now. And I think we need to be prepared for Donald Trump to try to really enact what he said he would do in the campaign. And if he was able to accomplish even a quarter of what he promised in the campaign, he will make the United States into a very different nation. And so I think those of us who want to resist this, those of us who want to stand against the way that this authoritarianism is insinuating its way into our government, I think we need to be very smart. I think we need to be very organized. I think we need to build the biggest tent coalition possible to resist this. We need to appeal to just about everyone, and we need to drop the petty squabbles that have dominated the more liberal and cosmopolitan cultural spaces and academic spaces over the last decade. And we need to find a way to speak to the middle of the country and build a super majority coalition to stand against MAGA, because MAGA really is about a third of the country, but there's a lot of people who are also sympathetic to that, and I think we need to try to persuade those people to come over to our side.
Well, you can count us in on the resistance, Matthew. We'll join you anytime. The book is titled "The Violent Take by Force: The Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy." Again, it is one of the best researched books that I have ever read, particularly about the New Apostolic Reformation. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us on Good Faith Weekly this week. It has been a delight. You have taught us a tremendous amount of knowledge, so thank you for that. But before we let you go, we've got one last question for you, Matthew, and Missy gets to ask it.
So, Matthew, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
We are in a moment right now where Christianity is declining in the United States, and I think a lot of us feel very disillusioned with Christianity. Our institutions are failing us. We're seeing these abuse scandals, and I think a lot of people, especially people who grew up within evangelicalism, are in this mode of deconstructing. Right, we're trying to reconsider our faith, trying to hold on to faith somehow. My message for those folks is deconstructing is important. We also need to be constructing.
Mm.
And so the week after the election, I started writing my next book, and it is a book of theology. It's a book challenging this theology of Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism from the very foundations of Christianity. Not like, oh, I've got a Bible verse here or there, but how do you reconcile these ideas of Christian dominance with a God who chooses not to dominate?
Yeah.
With Jesus being the incarnate one who comes to the lowest part of society and tells his followers to be servants, right? So I think we need to have more theological discussions. We need to have more theological engagement, challenging these things and doing it from a place of confidence, from a place of joy, and from a place that is grounded in the Bible. And I know that some people are not Christians and they can't do that. But those of us who are Christians, I think that is part of our duty right now, is to have some good theological fights.
Oh, wow. That's such an important word because, as you said, we've been deconstructing for quite some time now. It's time that we come together, work together to build something and a hopeful future that's built on inclusion and love and hope and justice. So, Matthew, thank you so much. You are welcome back to Good Faith Weekly anytime, my friend.
Thank you for having me. I'd love to come back sometime.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I just finished up our conversation with Matthew Taylor, who's got a new book out titled "The Violent Take It by Force: The Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy." Well, Missy, I was really looking forward to our conversation with Matthew because of my history within the charismatic movement growing up in Tulsa, but also just kind of watching this on the fringe for so many years now. I had no idea what prominence that this movement has gained up to this point.
Right. And I think he does a great job in the book of also explaining to us how this is it's sort of under the umbrella of Christian nationalism, but very different.
Right.
And so it made me really think about all of the conversations, all the books that we've read, the interviews that we've done with, the political movements and with religious movements. And it just made me think about the different factions and how There are very strange bedfellows in our political world today.
There are, Missy. Very strange bedfellows. Yes, absolutely.
That's what I kept thinking, like, make it make sense. Because even when he broke down the, charismatic movement, the NAR movement with, and juxtaposed to uh, evangelical movement, it's kind of very different what they're sort of trying to accomplish, but they've come together in a weird way. But
So I had to reset my mind a little bit around that because, one of the things he pointed out in the interview and in the book is that the new Apostolic Reformation is not necessarily looking for a theocracy.
right.
They're buying into the fact that it's a secular government, but they want their person leading that secular government, and then they are influencing government from their position as apostles. And I had to reset my thinking about that because for so long I have thought about the religious right as a theocracy of trying to put their person who is theologically pure into office. But the theological gymnastics that they've had to go to get to this point is really remarkable because it's no longer about character or values or the values we want in a leader. It's the person that's going to be able to achieve what you want as far as you want the outcome you're looking for.
Right. And I remember back during the 2016 election cycle, when Trump was gaining momentum amongst, the evangelicals and so Christians,
Right.
all stripes, so to speak. And there was a certain subset that really needed to know that he was a Christian, whatever
Right.
that meant in their mind, whether born again or baptized, whatever. And so they did this little song and dance where I don't remember who it was, but the spiritual advisor came out and said, "Oh yes, I was with Trump and he, quote unquote, accepted Christ." Am I remembering this
Oh,
correctly?
yeah. No, you're absolutely remembering it.
And so there's a certain subset that needed to have that stamp on there. But then it seems like Matthew's talking about a different subset. They're like, we know he's not going to be, a believer. And all
Right,
that.
yeah.
We know that he's an instrument, and tie him to biblical characters, to the Cyrus, and then to Jehu, who I'm not super familiar with that story, unfortunately. But it's just really interesting. It just makes me think of all of the theological and mental gymnastics one has to go through to keep adjusting your ethic and adjusting your standard and your moral code to get what you want.
Yeah.
And when you think you're in war, you'll do anything. I guess.
It's very simplistically, it is the ends justify the means. And we see this theologically. I mean, you can remember when President Clinton was in office and he got caught having an extramarital affair. And you can remember how outraged the religious right was during that time period. And, they were calling about the importance of character in the office and morals in the office and values in the office. Well, now they have totally abandoned that concept and have decided that it's okay to have somebody who doesn't follow all of our teachings, but will make certain things get done in our way.
Yes, and it actually reminded me of the conversation we had with Randall Ballmer earlier in the week on our special episode about President Carter after his passing, and how he mentioned that President Carter was elected on the heels of Vietnam War and Watergate, where people were wanting, they're really craving that kind of that honest, I won't lie to you, just really resonated with people. So you get this man who's just as upstanding a citizen as one could get, moral character and code and ethic and all this. And then, you swing back. So now we're back on the other end of the pendulum.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me wonder, well, is there another like Jimmy Carter type coming down the road? I don't know.
Yeah, right.
But as you're talking about the progression, so if we take your example from Carter, then we get to Clinton, now get to Trump, and who, as far as who that voting bloc is largely supporting, so to speak. I just wonder, like, what's next? What do we need to do next to twist, our standards, our theology, to make our ends as however we want them to be come to fruition.
Yeah, well, God forbid that Matthew's analogy comes true and that we end up with a government similar to Saudi Arabia where we have a monarchy. That I just can't handle.
No.
I mean, it's going to be enough getting through the next 4 years, but facing a Trump monarchy, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can go very much longer with that.
But like and you and I have talked about offline, and he talked about it a little bit in the book, is this movement is so wrapped up around the theatrics.
Yes.
And it's almost like, as I was reading it, I was like, okay, this is almost like, I feel like Trump is in his very own Truman Show, but it's backwards, where like he's the only one that knows he's on the stage performing, and everybody else are the players around. And that's kind of what he was describing this movement. It's all about the theater of it. The spiritual warfare, the demons, the levels, the apostles, all of this that's going on in this realm that we cannot see. And then we're forced to enact these things as we can see them. It's all theater. And that it's really disheartening, because this is affecting real people's lives, and it's affecting our world and our nation. So
when you brought that to my attention, I thought it was really significant, because I've always scratched my head. Why I can see why a movement would need a president. Not sure why the president would need this movement necessarily, but Trump has gravitated
But
towards
if you
them.
love performing on your stage.
Exactly. This is the kind of Christianity that Trump could get behind, that it is a lot of performance. It's performative based. And that's all he really is a performer. And that's what he's about.
All right. I agree. So some things are making sense as far as those strange bedfellows are becoming, in my mind, less strange bedfellows, I guess, when you start reducing it to the common denominator there. But it's interesting from an analytical standpoint to look at it, but at the same time, it's really tragic how such movements are really affecting our policies and are affecting human beings and life and justice and liberty and all those things that we're supposed to stand for.
Yep. So anybody interested that follows faith and politics, that's followed the rise of the religious right, this is an important book to have on your bookshelf, because Matthew Taylor does a great job with it.
I agree.
So the book is The Violent Take It by Force. It is really well done. Great research in it. You're going to want it on your bookshelves, as I said a moment ago, and just really enjoyed our conversation with Matthew.
Yeah, the book was great. I highly recommend it. I just think it's knowledge and information we all need to have.
Absolutely. Well, Missy and I will be back next week. Hopefully she'll be back from the mountains and I'll stop coughing so that she'll return home. But until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.